Welcome to Just One Q, the podcast where we explore the latest ideas in workplace diversity, equity, and inclusion in conversation with thought leaders and DEI experts. Each episode, a guest and I dive into one question, highlighting their area of expertise in DEI. The goal is to leave you with the tools and insights that you need to drive change in your own life, both personally and professionally. I'm your host, Dominique Atrell. I'm a DEI educator and advocate working for Dialectic, an inclusive workplace learning consultancy in lovely Guelph, Ontario, which is situated on the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the traditional lands of the Chinoochtan and the Haudenosaunee peoples. On this week's episode, I have the pleasure of speaking with Rochelle Ramathe. Rochelle is a trailblazer in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Born in Alberta, Canada, to parents from Jamaica and Barbados, Rochelle's journey is a testament to the transformational power of cultural understanding. As a dedicated DEI strategist, Rochelle thrives on developing innovative strategies that foster diverse, equitable, and inclusive cultures within organizations. With over 20 years of experience, she has spearheaded initiatives to drive meaningful change and promote belonging across industries. As a global speaker, Rochelle has spoken in Jamaica, in South Korea, in South Africa, in the US, and in Canada. She's also an author, in her books Why My Black Skin Matters, Black Faces in White Spaces, 9 Secrets for Black Women to Thrive in the Workplace, and most recently, From D's to a Master's Degree, 7 Keys to Success for Black Students, have become manifestos of empowerment resonating with audiences worldwide. Black Faces in White Spaces, which we'll discuss in a little bit more detail today, is a book that aims to equip Black women with a roadmap to confidently navigate their careers, overcome obstacles, and contribute to creating more inclusive and equitable workplaces. Rochelle, thank you so much for being here and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So today we're going to dive into a key question, which is how can Black women leverage mentorship and sponsorship in white workplaces? And we're going to touch on 3 key topics: mentorship, sponsorship, and cultural capital. And these are all 3 interwoven topics. And we're going to talk about how global majority people who are navigating in predominantly white workspaces can leverage these 3 things for success. So before we kick off, I just want to ask you to tell me a little bit about yourself and what motivated you to write Black Faces in White Spaces specifically.
Yes, so I'm originally from Edmonton, Alberta. I honestly believe it's one of the coldest places on the planet. So I'm happy I don't live there anymore. So I grew up in a home where my parents fostered 3 children. 2 were Indigenous and 1 was a white child with a disability. It was a severe disability. And I was able to see, of course, my mom's from Jamaica, my dad's from Barbados, but I was able to see that it actually is possible for inclusion to take place regardless of culture and race. But my challenges when I went into the schools or when I went into workplaces, it was really hard for me to experience that and even see that it can be done effectively. So for me, that kind of it brought me into this world of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I had a front row seat to the fact that actually it can work. And then I would probably say what motivated me to head in this direction of Black faces in white spaces. I'd say 2 things. I would probably for sure say when I think about the Black Canadian experience, I don't see a lot of people sharing the truth and kind of unveiling or pulling the curtain aside so that people can see what is truly happening in the workplace, particularly to Black women. And I remember speaking to a friend last week, and she was saying, "You are so bold and so courageous because this was happening to me, but I said nothing." But her story was a testament to a lot of the Black women I was meeting that said, "This is my story, but I say nothing. This is my story, and I say nothing." So I was like, I want to say something. So that's what pivoted me in this direction of how can I not only shed light on the challenges Black women in the workplace are experiencing, but how can I also create some sort of strategies, secrets, or solutions so that they can move from just maybe striving or surviving in the workplace to truly thriving.
And that's absolutely something that stood out to me from your book is that it is very solutions focused, which I really appreciate. I love a good solutions focused book because understanding the problem is just half of the battle. And it's obviously a very important piece of it, as you said, especially in the Canadian context where we love to pretend, that we're better. We love to
Mhm,
pretend, especially when it comes to DEI and the idea of a cultural mosaic. I was raised in
mhm,
Ontario, and as a child, that was certainly the narrative was,
mhm,
I went to schools in Mississauga in Ontario, and it was very diverse,
mhm.
ethnically and culturally. And I remember, really being told that it's because we value culture, we value inclusion, and we want to create a mosaic of a society, which is sort of like the counterpoint to the American melting pot, right? Where we want to
Yes.
emphasize everybody's culture and what they bring.
Yeah.
But man, in practice, that is not necessarily
Mm,
happening.
no.
So the narrative is there, but the more Black women I speak to, certainly in this line of work, the more I hear those stories that you're referring to as well. So thank
Absolutely.
you. Thank you for writing this book. I think it's very important. I do
Mhm,
encourage our listeners to read it if you feel like it applies to you, which I think it can apply to a very broad audience, actually. But it's a wonderful exploration, particularly about these pieces that we're going to touch upon today: mentorship, sponsorship. And I want to pivot to that and ask you, why is it important that we keep talking about mentorship and sponsorship? Like these feel to me like topics that I've heard quite a bit about in the past, I don't know, decade or two, even.
mhm.
What is it that people aren't understanding or implementing about mentorship and sponsorship?
So that's a really good question. And I agree with you. We talk about it a lot, but the question is, why is it important? And what does it actually practically look like in terms of what I'm sharing? So I remember reading the work of Dr. William Smith. He coined the term in 2004. It's called racial battle fatigue.
Mm,
And he was essentially saying that when people of color get into the workplace, so he started his research just with Black employees, Black students, and then he widened the net because he noticed this was a challenge with people of color. So when we get into workplaces, there's actually a battle taking place that no one names. We didn't know it's a fight, but it is happening. Sometimes people who look like me don't even know this is happening, and absolutely people that don't look like me, they don't know what's happening. So something as simple as a Black woman saying, how should I wear my hair in this workplace? If I wear it natural, maybe, and with an afro, will I be deemed professional?
mm,
Dr. Williams says that's a battle. Or when we're the only one in a room, Dr. Williams says that's actually a battle. And what he's saying is that it actually impacts us, not just psychologically, but it impacts our health when we're fighting some things that we may not even know or we may know, but we choose to say nothing about it. So when I think mentorship and particularly sponsorship, one of the things that he mentions is a battle. This idea that sometimes we sit in workplaces, we know we can do the job, but we see unfair promotion practices. So we
mm.
see we could do the job, but we see who's promoted. So what he says, mentorship is important because sometimes you feel like it's just you.
Right.
Sometimes you're very isolated. But when you start talking to others and you hear someone say, well, that's happening to me, or that happened to me, and this is how I navigated it, it's almost like I needed that guidance. just to survive one more day in this workplace, or I needed that advice just to stay here even 2 more days, or I needed that insight to get the courage again to apply again for a job that I know I can do. So when I think mentorship, it's this idea of not feeling alone, understanding there are battles you're facing and you need support to deal with that. So absolutely mentorship, but from that lens of racial battle fatigue, and you cannot fight this thing alone.
I've never heard those words before, racial battle fatigue. I think that's a
Yes.
really interesting term. And
Hmm.
certainly it makes sense and it resonates in terms of feeling, even in your body and in your health,
Yes.
the impacts
Yes.
of the cumulative
Yes.
toll of all of these little microaggressions or being passed over or,
Yes.
spinning your wheels or trying to represent your entire group in a room. And I think that, anybody who has an identity that isn't a majority identity in a space has had that experience to a degree, right? And so it's helpful to imagine, embodying that day in and day out without any relief. And what I'm hearing is like
Yes.
the idea that mentorship and sponsorship can really be kind of a balm for that, that there is encouragement to be found in just story sharing and in feeling support from somebody who's nested within your organization who can kind of see you, right?
Mm,
Yeah.
that's it. And
Yeah.
I love that you use the word see you. And I do want to say that mentorship and sponsorship is not the same thing. So,
Mm,
mentorship, if I think about 3 words, it would be about guidance, it would be about advice, and it would be about personal development. So, when I think mentorship, think those 3 things: guidance, advice, personal development. But when you think sponsorship, it actually is more skin in the game, we'd call it. It actually means advocacy and trying to open the door to advancement for people who aren't able to be there. So what it does call on is actually more allies. So mentorship can happen with many people who look like me, but if we're in an organization where 90% of the people or 80% of the people that are advancing are white, then that would mean that there's an onus on those who are allies to say, you know what? I'm going to put sometimes my reputation on the line so that I can advocate for this particular person so that they too can have the opportunity to really the opportunity to do what they've always done. They
mhm,
know how to do the work. But because of the promotion practices here, we understand that people actually might not even see that they could do the work. So
mhm.
I'm willing to advocate so that we can open the door for those who are often not at the top.
That's fantastic. And I want to take time with you to unpack both of those concepts more
Hmm.
in this conversation. I like the idea that, you have precise definitions of both, and I have a lot of questions about both, so we'll get to
Good.
those. But I'm wondering if we can just talk first about this idea of networking or just the
Hmm.
power that exists in finding connection with other people who have a shared lived experience. First of all, could you talk to what the goal should be when Black women or other members of the global majority set out to intentionally expand or create their network? What does a quality contact look like, and what
Hmm.
should we hope to gain in kind of in creating that network for ourselves?
Hmm. That's a really, really good question. And I love that you said, what's the goal? Because I think every relationship begins with that question. What is the goal for why I'm trying to network? So, first of all, it actually should be a reciprocal exchange. So, it shouldn't be something where I'm coming into this thing only focused on what I can get. It should always be, how can we have a reciprocal experience, but it's not a reciprocal experience where I'm the mentor of the mentor, but it's I'm respecting that particular role. And I would say you want to start with what is your goal. So for me, I know something in terms of my public speaking aspect of my business. I knew I wanted to network with a Black woman who is also a motivational speaker who has way more years of experience than me because there's something that she could share with me and something that I could, if there's anything she needs from me, I'm definitely available. Even if it's something as simple as giving you a testimonial of this is my experience when I worked with this particular person. So I would say understand the goal. So for me, it was absolutely to move forward in my career, but with someone who looks like me. And it's something this simple. Maybe your listeners may not agree with it. I know sometimes if it's a Black person listening, I know there's a lot of debate around this, but one of the things my mentor mentioned, if you are actually going to speak, particularly for corporate, there's some things you might have to consider in terms of your hair. Like if you wanted to do what is maybe outrageous. I don't even want to use that word, but if you want to, maybe you want to have purple hair or pink hair because you just want to express yourself. That's fine. But she said you need to be okay with the barriers that come along with that. It was something even as simple as your headshot picture. You're maybe showing a lot of skin. And if you're wanting to kind of speak to corporate, maybe you might want to look a little more conservative. So the point is, if a white woman told me that, I might be like, how dare she? But it was a Black mentor who's further along her journey that said, hey, I'm going to grapple with you with some of these ideas and concepts. It's all going to come from a place of love. I'm going to talk with you quite frank in terms of what this industry looks like. So for me, and this idea of the goal of networking or mentorship, it is to ask yourself, what do you want? Do I want career advancement? Well, that would determine that. And I also want to put in this caveat for mentorship because I know we don't often talk about this, but it's this idea of the character traits of the person. Because all of us, example, there was a year that I was really big on, I want to make six figures. I want to make six figures. And then I was trying to go into rooms where people were doing that. But then the way that person was making it didn't feel good. And then the way I was treated or saw that person treating someone else, yeah, all of them made six figures, but character wise, that didn't feel good. So I would say mentorship isn't always about the bigger picture in terms of career advancement or how do I navigate this very difficult place as a person of color. It's also what character trait do I want to demonstrate along this journey of my career?
That's a really good encouragement and one I will take personally, and I hope that some of our listeners do as well. But I like the level of intentionality that you're bringing there in terms of what makes a quality contact and what you can gain. How can workplaces support networking activities that are sort of outside of white-centric ways of doing things? I know it's up to each individual in a way to kind of work a network and to do that sort of informally and then find channels to do it with that are maybe industry specific. But are there generic things that average workplaces can do to support this kind of activity?
Mhm. I think two things. One is recognizing we don't know all the answers. So this idea, sometimes in white-centric environments, there's maybe a tendency and a motivation to make things formal. Like, let's have a formal networking event. But really, sometimes it's just have an celebration and let people do what they do. What
Mm.
you may see in the celebration is certain people will gravitate towards certain people. I know for me, there's one particular lady, and I will mention her later in terms of who I would like to kind of put a spotlight on, but she's a human rights lawyer. I met her in the workplace environment. And one of the things we naturally did was, hey, let's go to lunch together. And then we were at lunch together, and I do write this in my book. we literally started talking about hair and hair products and all of these different things that had nothing to do with work. But at the end of the day, we were able to network in such a powerful way, and it wasn't formal. So I would say sometimes just give people an opportunity to do what they naturally do, but have opportunities for them to come together, perhaps maybe events, maybe even, I mean, there are conferences unique for certain identities. So example, maybe Black women. I'd actually say even allocate aspects of your budget for personal development and let them choose events that they want to go to, because perhaps networking with people, studied social work. So it wasn't only valuable for me to network with Black social workers, but it was very helpful for me to network with just Black professionals, particularly ones that were wanting to kind of elevate their career. So then I would look for conferences like that. So sometimes maybe when we're in our workplaces, say it's social work oriented, we might be thinking, let's just do a formal networking thing with just social workers. But if we actually said, you know what, let's just have a budget of PD, personal development, and let each staff member have the autonomy to say, where do I want to go to expand my network?
I love that idea. That's really great. And I'm not sure I've ever heard anybody say that before. So thanks for the fresh perspective. I think, yeah, just trusting people to make those connections in a natural way, giving time and space for things that are not so rigid or so official.
Yes.
Yeah, that it makes a ton of sense that people will find those paths themselves and gravitate towards the things that they need, particularly if they've
Mm-hmm.
done the thing that you were mentioning about, thinking through what their goals are and bringing some intention to that. So I like those ideas hand in hand with one another. I want to shift gears a little bit. In DEI land, we talk a
Mm-hmm.
lot about mentorship and how essential it is, particularly to the retention and the promotion pieces of the talent pipeline. I'm wondering, what does a good mentorship program look like from a Black woman's perspective?
It definitely moves away from tokenism and check boxes. I think that's important because when I talked about this racial battle fatigue, it's the idea of sometimes being the only one in the room. So when we
Mm,
think about retention, we now have to start thinking about how can we get more people in the room, not just one, because you won't stay in any environment if you feel like I'm just surviving and I'm not thriving. So I would say ask the people. I think that is so huge. Sometimes we try to create things in rooms with people who don't look like us. Well, if we really just ask the people, I think that that would be powerful.
mm,
So I would say, what could that look like? It's important to contextualize it. So what it looks like in this workplace versus this workplace versus this workplace. I wouldn't be able to give a cookie cutter answer, but what I will be able to say is people know what they need in order to thrive. So it's important to ask them. But I would say the second thing, I'd honestly say ask them anonymously. Because
mm,
what I've seen so many times in the workplace is when people tell the truth, there are consequences to it sometimes. So I know we don't necessarily talk about that. I did mention my friend who said, I don't say anything, and I'm glad you say something. But what she doesn't realize is why I don't have a 9 to 5 right now and why I'm a full-time entrepreneur is because I say something. So the reality is when you tell the truth about what could make this environment better for Black women, you need to be okay to accept the consequences that come along with it. So if all of us need to pay our mortgage or whatever our bills are, then I think workplaces need to be a little more open to having anonymous feedback so that the workplace can be better for all and understand because of maybe the social work background, psychological safety. Sometimes we don't feel safe telling the truth. So how can we create environments where people feel safe to tell the truth and where people don't experience consequences for telling the truth?
this is a something I keep hearing as I'm doing more and more of these podcast interviews, and I cross paths with people through work in DEI as well, this idea that, women and especially women of color are kind of withdrawing from workplaces and seeking sort of that contractor life, and being their own boss, because not that it's not a viable option and not that it's not, doesn't have its benefits, but often it's disproportionate. And it's because the needs are just not being supported in the workplace. So you have companies that are striving to hit, diversity quotas, for example, which is a whole other issue and a whole other
Yes.
podcast. But I think they're trying very hard to hire in, and then they're not creating the supports that are necessary to keep people
In.
there to, yeah, to keep people in. And so
Mm-hmm.
there's sometimes once people have a sufficient amount of experience out the door, right? And
Mm-hmm.
what a loss to organizations. I think we should acknowledge that too, that it's from an organizational perspective, there goes your talent, there goes all the
Mm-hmm.
knowledge, there goes the wisdom of your organization walking out the door. So
Mm-hmm.
there is definitely incentive to do these things that you're saying, that, we should be asking, we should be anonymizing, we should be consulting people about the types of mentorship that they want and trying to create psychological safety in those environments. It makes perfect sense to me.
I do want to add this idea of interrogating yourself. I
Mm,
think sometimes you're always focused on the other, maybe quotas and all those things, but interrogate, do you really even want this? Because maybe you don't. It sounds good to say, I want diversity, but when there's a challenge to your ideas, do you really want that? And I think this is important. I do think how we do one thing is how we do everything. So I
mm,
would actually just say, by virtue of making it easy, just look at your relationships in general. So if you have a spouse, if you have a partner, if you have a best friend, how do you respond to that person when they share something with you that you don't like to hear, or when they have a different idea, or they are suggesting that you do something different? And I'm going to put my hand up for a moment because my husband loves hiking. And one particular day, I made the mistake and said, okay, I'll go with him because he invited me. And then I knew why I made a mistake when I got there. There was a sign, there was a sign, and there were literally two ways you could go. There was a sign that said, this, if you go this way, there are bear spotting. So people see bears. So bears are in this direction. And in this direction, people don't really see that. And then they gave you an opportunity to take the path. And so my husband had the nerve to want to go right. And I thought to myself, someone needs to be alive to tell the story. So,
ah,
but because he's an expert in hiking, I'm going to be honest, I went in the direction that he suggested very reluctantly. I do have to admit, after that hiking experience, I have never gone back. But I think the bigger question is what happened? What happens when someone's leading you in a direction that's scary,
mm,
or in a direction that you don't want to go in, or a direction that you don't feel like you're ready for? Because how you did that with your spouse, or how you did that with a best friend, or how you did that with a colleague is probably how you'd react to someone now who's in the role of perhaps a diversity, equity, and inclusion, maybe consultant or a speaker or someone. So I want you to start thinking, or I want your listeners to start thinking, how I do one thing is how I do everything. So I need to start interrogating myself and stop looking externally to make sure I check some boxes.
I love that. It's really making it personal. It really hits home,
Mhm.
right? Yeah. And just identifying those relational patterns and our
Yes.
responses to being, whether you want to call it called out or whatever, but
Yes.
invited to change,
Yes.
and how we respond to that being a good indicator of how we respond in general. I think you're
Yes.
not wrong. You're not wrong. Um, so can I ask, in the context, maybe like picking up with from this idea of how we respond, what does a good mentor look like? And
Mhm,
when somebody is seeking mentorship, how can they be sure that they're not wasting precious time and energy
mhm,
with the wrong mentor?
mhm. I think that's really a very good question. I think that there are some just general traits based on humanity that you'd like. So you'd like an exchange to be respectful. You'd like an exchange to be patient. But you would also, then it depends on your personality. Maybe you're someone who's kind of more direct. So you want something that's more direct. Maybe you're someone who's really practical. So you want your responses to be really practical. So something as simple as my mentor, if I say to her, so I have a speaking engagement, say, so example, last week I had a speaking engagement. I called my mentor maybe a month before to ask her to help me prepare for it. She was very practical, like so practical that she looked at my PowerPoint presentation and she was like, oh no, the S is over here and it should be more over. So it was like
Mm,
just so technical, but I'm like, I love that because I
mm,
wanted that to look good. Or she'd say, like practical things, you probably want to practice, your style seems to be more storytelling. So try to find a way to tell a story. So she
mm,
was really practical. I needed that. But there are some mentors that are just giving you maybe high concept things. You grapple with things intellectually, and then that's pretty much it. But I think the bigger goal is how can I move from where I am to a better place in my career?
mm.
So maybe it could be a mentor that you could say, hey, I'm struggling with my hair. I do. That was so my mentor. So this is example of why Black women shouldn't just have Black mentors. Like I told you, if your organization, 90% of people are white and they're
Yeah.
in higher positions, there's room for everyone. But for her, something this simple, she was like, oh, just get a wig made that is custom made. And then she was like, every time you speak, just use that if you feel comfortable. Or so the point is she was giving me different options. I do not think if I had a mentor that didn't look like me, she would even be able to let me know, okay, think about this,
Mm,
custom this. This is where you could go for this. That
mm,
so I would definitely say bigger picture with a mentor, you want to move beyond where you are in your career. So look around at people that you think may be a good choice. And I would just say, practically speaking, you may not be able to see a mentor maybe in your local environment. I think that's where online is huge, particularly LinkedIn, because ideally that's maybe where a lot of career people are. So you could even just do a simple search. So I've been talking about my
mm.
mentor quite a bit. I got my mentor from LinkedIn, and you'll be amazed. My mentor is actually she was Miss USA 2016. Her name is
Oh,
Deshauna
wow.
Barber.
Yeah.
Exactly. She's an amazing motivational speaker. But the point is, I found her on LinkedIn. I
Yeah.
just private messaged her. I was like, I just saw this clip of you. This was powerful. I love the way you told stories. Are you are you a mentor? Are you open to doing mentorship? She was like, oh yeah, in a couple of months, you read my mind because I'm having a mentorship program in a couple of months. And after that, I joined her mentorship program. And after that mentorship program, she hasn't been able to get rid of me.
That's amazing. I love that like LinkedIn is basically, the online dating equivalent for
Absolutely.
finding mentors. That's great tip. I like that.
Absolutely.
And I think it's honest, right? Like we need to be a bit creative sometimes if we don't want to be
Hmm.
limited in who we turn to. Sometimes
Hmm.
there isn't a person in the immediate environment, and it's then
Yes.
falls to us to kind of do the legwork and find someone to be brave enough to ask too. Like, I'm not
Hmm.
sure that I would have been brave enough to ask somebody who's not already even advertising that kind of service. But
Exactly.
good for you. Good for you.
That's why it's important to be intentional, right? Because you
Hmm.
never know what someone will say if you just ask.
Hmm. Yeah. Let's switch gears a little bit. I want to talk about sponsorship. So,
Mhm,
you gave us an idea or a hint earlier about how it's different from mentorship. So, I'm wondering
mhm.
if you can expand on that a little bit and just differentiate the two concepts.
And I think it's important to preface the context because I know when we're in this realm of diversity, equity, and inclusion, sometimes we're saying, but that's not equitable. When we think about sponsorship, we kind of
Mm,
say, no, but you gave that person an advantage. But I think it's important to look at the context and it's important to talk about one, why we need sponsorship, and
yep.
two, that it is not unfair, particularly with this lens of diversity, equity, inclusion. As I mentioned before, sometimes when you look to the top, I know the organizations I've been a part of when I was an employee, at the top, white men or white women.
Mhm.
If there were women of color or people of color, perhaps it'd be one or two, but not a lot, which would mean that in order for me to get to a place that I desire to get to in terms of advancing my career in this particular environment, it would mean allies actually would have to carry maybe the load much more than I can.
Mm,
Allies have access to rooms that I may never be able to access if they did not say my name. And sponsorship is important because your supervisor or whoever you report you to, they actually see your work. They actually see that you maybe come to work on time. They actually see that, oh, this project that she did, or the speech that she did, or the presentation, or the way she worked with this particular customer or client, they see or they hear, oh, she did an amazing job. So the question is, how do we move from you seeing and hearing that I've done an amazing job to how can she now advance or what can I say about her? I do think, to be honest, this is a hard one because I
mm,
think sometimes you have to ask yourself, do I really want to even advance in this environment? Because some
right.
environments are honestly toxic.
Yeah.
And honestly, some environments, the people who they are advancing, that says something about the organization. So
Mm,
I think you should ask yourself the question, do I want to advance here? Not do I want to advance in my career? Because I think maybe I don't want to speak for everyone. But a lot of people do want to advance in their career. But the question is, do I want to advance in my career here? And I say that because there have been women of color that have been in high positions. We know it was Harvard that a Black leader of the institution, a Black woman, Claudine Gay, she resigned.
mm,
So sometimes it's not just about I want to get up there. I think it's important to know what does it mean, not only just to get up there, but to stay there and ask yourself, do I want that? Or can I go to another organization that maybe feels better for me to get that thing in terms of moving up in terms of your career? But on the flip side, I do have a friend. She is Black. She has a supervisor. She's white and she has been a sponsor to the with a capital S. She sees my friend's work, but what she does, she actually doesn't just look at the fact that maybe the next role is a director, but she did something a little more unique. She went to people higher than her because
mm,
she was able to access those rooms. And she said, I know if we get another director to fill this particular spot, this person's probably going to retire 10 years from now. So we need a director in this particular person now. So I'm going to advocate that we actually create a position. So to me, I thought, wow, not only is she seeing my friend's value and her work and what she brings to the organization, she's also knowledgeable to say, hey, this person is not leaving their position anytime soon. So then she says, hey, I'll put my reputation on the line to say, this worker I have, she's good. And yes, I believe that she's director material. And yes, now that I know that we have a certain amount of money, I think we should create another position so that she could be the director of that. So I think that was such a powerful example of sponsorship.
I love that example. And I want to acknowledge the piece that you said just before about, I think what you're describing is the idea of the glass cliff.
Mm,
which is a tendency in certain organizations to intentionally promote women or women of color in really hard times and let them
yes.
take the fall for things. And so
Yes.
there's this phenomenon that does happen where it's not that you can't access, it's like, when can you access? Are you going to
Yes.
be scapegoated? Are you going to,
Mm,
um, what's the reason that somebody is trying to put you there? And I like
yes.
how disappointing it is that people need to be aware and sort of skeptical of sponsorship sometimes. But I
Yes.
don't know if you've had any examples of that kind of thing in your experience, but it's certainly something I've read about and that I know is going on, unfortunately.
I love that. I love that. For sure, in this field, I think they do promote a lot of Black women when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion. I have seen that quite a bit. So, this particular role, it's not uncommon to see Black women in it, but it's also not uncommon to see when you hear the private stories, she's isolated and
Mm,
it's about the way that she makes the organization look. So, kind of like
right.
make our image look good
Yeah.
even though we know we're not doing good things, or thank you so much for your ideas and your solutions. We're not listening to it, but we need you in this position. So
Right.
they don't say that, but you could definitely tell that they think that. And you can definitely tell that others are encouraged to think that. And so the way I see a director treat another director will also condition me to believe that the way you treat her is
Mm,
okay. So then other people will start doing the same thing. So it's a very lonely place sometimes when you want to go higher, but I'm not saying that's for every organization. So I think you should examine for yourself, why do I want to advance in my career? And do I want to do it here?
yeah, I love that. I want to jump back to the idea of, I don't think you said this word, the word nepotism, and how some people do equate, unfortunately, sponsorship with nepotism,
Yes,
because I think that is how traditionally a lot of white people have experienced sponsorship is, you
yes,
have a relative, let's say in
yes,
a high place, and your name does get dropped in certain rooms, and lo and behold, you get the
yes,
job. So
yes.
so how do we break up with that conception, or can you maybe explain what makes sponsorship different from nepotism?
Yes, I'm so glad you said that. So, when I think about 2 years ago, we had my son on a soccer team. So, the soccer coach, his son was on the team. His son's name's Jack, and he was horrible. My son, though, my son, he was equally as bad as Jack. So, we thought, whoa, we're wasting our money on this little boy. But let's just go to the games anyways. So when we noticed that we would go to the games, literally every time, like I want to stress, every time Jack had the ball, his dad would always say, "Big kick, Jack, big kick." But he'd say that because he knows his son kicks so soft that the
Mm,
ball doesn't even move, uh, like it doesn't move.
hmm.
So we would always hear him say, "Big kick, big kick." And then his son, he would big kick it, and it would be like he would do it out of bounds. So his dad knew he was horrible. Everyone in the world knew he was horrible. But what ended up happening was Jack was always chosen to play at the start. So it
Mm,
was important to have all the best players in the beginning. Jack was always chosen. Jack was really almost never on the bench. Jack does not have the skills. He does not have the capability, but
mm,
yet he has the position. So the
right.
difference with nepotism is it's not even like you might not even be able to do the job, but you'll be our accountant here because I know him and he said it should be you and I'm cousins with him. And so nepotism is always, I think, based on not only do I know this person or the name was dropped, but they may not be able to do the job. They haven't
Mm.
maybe even demonstrated they can do the job, but that doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
Sponsorship is different because it's a group of people that can actually do the job. It's a group of people that I continue to see there are unfair promotion practices. So, because I know this as an ally, hey, this is unfair and the person can do the job. So, you know what? I'm actually going to say something to other people that can make a decision because this person can do the job. So I think the difference is, can the person do the job, or the
Yeah.
person honestly can't do the job? So nepotism is maybe they actually can't do the job. Sponsorship is they can do the job.
Yeah. So an emphasis on skills, and I guess it's a combination of identity and skill as opposed to just identity. So like you're not being sponsored on just identity. You're being sponsored because somebody knows your work intimately and is in the
Absolutely.
correct rooms, right? Um,
Absolutely. And I believe that. And I like the word you use, intimately, because I do think when you refer people, it is a transfer of trust. So it's
mhm,
not just about that person, it's about that person's connected to my name. So
mhm,
I also want to ensure that this person can do the job. So sponsorship, you use the word intimately. I do think there is an element of knowing the person that is important, which is maybe one of the biggest dilemmas in workplaces today. We don't really talk about it, but it is hard sometimes for people of color to have relationships with people who may not look like them, or specifically white women. There are
mm,
things, much like any relationship, you bring baggage with you
yeah,
into this context of relationship. Like, even if we were just going to speak about friendship or couples, there's baggage you bring. But the difference is, when you're in a couple relationship, there are maybe platforms for you to unpack the baggage.
mhm,
I think what's difficult with racial relationships, particularly maybe white women and Black women, there's really no place to unpack that thing that we
mhm,
know we're carrying in a way that feels safe, that there's no white fragility that comes along with it, but
yeah.
we can move forward. We know couples counseling, you can do that. You can unpack it. There's a third party there. You can hear, oh, the person thinks this way. Okay, that person thinks this way. Okay, this is how we can get you relating better as a couple. But now, what happens in the workplace when perhaps it's a Black woman and a white woman? Where do we unpack that?
I agree with you, and I think it's a it's an important and a difficult to solve problem.
I know we're not going to unpack this completely, but it is this idea of cultural capital.
Yeah.
And when I say that, it's for, so example, my mom is Jamaican. What you find with culture, and I really want to stress cultural capital versus racial capital, because we're not all the same, although we're all Black. I'm
Mm,
talking about Black women.
mhm,
So my mom is Jamaican. So what you end up seeing when you think about the Jamaican culture, you definitely will see strong women. You'll probably definitely see women who have no problem sharing their perspective. You'll probably see that women are used to leading. You'll probably see, I know we're in Canada, we've never seen a female prime minister. In Jamaica, we have Portia Simpson Miller. We see, okay, we can see Black women lead countries, or my
mm,
dad's from Barbados. So we have Mia Motley.
mm.
She is in charge. She's the leader of Barbados. So I think one of the challenges, Black women, honestly, well, I'm just going to speak as a Jamaican. I automatically come into the work environment knowing I was not created for a cubicle. I'm
Mm,
actually allergic to a cubicle. And as a matter of fact, not only do I believe I can lead, I know I can, because I come from a community with a lot of women that can. So
mm.
this timidity, I don't think, like, I don't know if we had 90% of Black women leading a workplace and 90% of directors, I don't know if you would find a lot of fear around, oh, I don't want to say anything because my career, or no, I think we would find maybe some of us maybe not so diplomatic, me absolutely diplomatic, but we would have a way of saying, hence a lot of us are in these diversity leading positions, because
Right.
we might have no problem saying, hey, I notice you've overlooked that particular group. Can you help me understand why we're doing that, and how can we change the rules so that it's fair for all people? I
Mm.
don't think, well, I'm just speaking on behalf of the Jamaican women I've been exposed to. I don't think we have a challenge with that. So I do think it's an issue sometimes of confidence and feeling intimidated. I do know sometimes when I work with white women, I do think that there's an element of, first of all, she shouldn't be talking to me like this because
Oh,
I'm
wow.
the manager.
Mm.
And secondly, I will never go to bat for her. Or so it's
Mm.
already ingrained in us. Stand up for what's right.
Mm.
Speak out.
Mm.
So it's not hard. But if my ally believes it's hard, if my ally, to your point, is also maybe struggling with, hey, there's a glass ceiling for me as well.
Mm.
Yeah, I think the difference is maybe a Black woman might not be she might not be timid to shatter that ceiling.
Somebody who has lived experience where they have seen over and over and over systems that, chew them up and spit them out is going to have a very different perspective than somebody who believes if I just hold the line,
Yeah.
I'm gonna make it to the top. Like
Yeah.
it will fundamentally work if I just do
Yeah.
X, Y, Z. Or so, maybe that's a way to kind of think about um who you want to associate with in the workplace too, right? Like who's invested in sort of a more human project and who really thinks that everything is good already and all it needs is a couple of tweaks to serve them better. Um,
That
that's,
I hear what you're saying. I do want to step on your toes just a little bit.
yes,
I
please.
want to I do want to say we are not talking about the elephant in the room in terms
Mm,
of benefit. Like if I advocate for her, great. But if I don't, still great. Like I'll still have my salary.
right, right.
I'll still be able to purchase a cottage. I'll
Yes. Yeah.
still be able to take that trip to Cuba. So that's great. So I do want to say that there's another aspect of sponsorship, which is either way, if I'm a white woman or a white man, I benefit from both ways. So if
Mm,
it if we don't get more people of color up here, that's great. But if we do, that's great as well.
mm. Yeah. Thank you for bringing that. And it's hard to hear when you're working in DEI, obviously, as a lot of our listeners are. And there is a group of people who fundamentally want that to change and who are going to make personal investments to sponsor and understand kind of the bigger picture. And I hope that the message gets out to more people so that they too can kind of take a personal look at this and
Hmm.
feel like it's not the same. It's not going to be
Hmm.
okay. We're not going to be okay or stable or safe if we don't have inclusion. That's
Hmm.
again another question for another podcast, but it does have costs, right? It has costs.
Hmm.
So there are benefits to having Black women at the top of an organization that you're just not going to experience if you aren't doing the work to make that happen
That's
culturally.
right.
Yeah.
I love
So,
that you said that it has costs. And I think what we don't see, you know how I talk about racial battle fatigue? There's
yeah.
actually also something called ally fatigue. It's
Mm,
this idea of there is a cost to me as an ally, but how long do I have to pay this cost? Or what happens when
mm,
I get tired as well? So I think that's an important aspect to consider. It may not be that the person's not willing to advocate. It may be they too are tired. It may mean the cost to me, I didn't know the journey would be this long. I
Right.
thought maybe since George Floyd, we'd maybe a year or two,
Yeah.
we'd be allies. But what the rest of my life, yeah, no, I didn't consider that cost. And you know what? Sometimes I'm tired on the journey. So can I be tired and will that be okay as well?
Mm. Can you give us some examples of how, I mean, you've already spoken a little bit about cultural capital in terms of, Jamaican women's leadership, for example. Are there other examples of how culture can be an asset to an individual and to their organization? I'm not asking because I don't know that that's true. I'm asking because I would love to give you an opportunity to just paint that picture of the ways that culture can be reinvigorating or bring something to an organization that wasn't previously there.
Mhm. So I would probably say, in terms of research, it actually says that companies do better when they have diverse perspectives. So first of all, in terms of a business case and a profit case, this idea of cultural capital means exactly what this person is bringing is beneficial because it's going to give us a perspective and a way of doing things that we may never have considered. So I think if we start from that place, it would be really good. And in my book, I do highlight Chimamanda. She's a Nigerian writer. She's amazing. And those who may be listening may have seen her YouTube talk called The Danger of a Single Story. She's very big on maybe even what she wears. And she uses specifically, she had a campaign for using Nigerian fashion designers. But I think what she's really brilliant at, she's brilliant at storytelling.
Mhm.
And I think that when we talk about these topics, I think that we need to talk about them in a way that are maybe sometimes more palatable. It is hard to hear things if it's maybe sometimes not dressed up in a story. So I don't want to move from Nigeria to go back to Jamaica, but in Jamaica, they have a story. It's called Anansi the Spider. And this character in the Jamaican context is someone who tells stories. So it's a folklore, tells stories, but just to bring out a main point. But they do that with humor. They do it to bring out things like resilience. They bring out topics like maybe togetherness and community. But I'm saying that to say, particularly these topics are hard topics. So what
Mhm.
if someone has a gift of storytelling?
Yeah.
Perhaps that actually is an asset to the environment versus maybe someone who stands up with a PowerPoint, reads the definition, and this is what equity means, and this is what diversity means. So the
Yeah.
reality is maybe some cultures may not have a better way to present.
Mm.
Perhaps storytelling is better. So I would just say, sometimes let's get out of the way, observe who's good at what, and allow them to do what they're good at,
Mm.
understanding the bigger picture. So for me, example, when I got married in South Africa, but my husband and I were living in Korea at the time before we went to South Africa. And one of the things I realized is I need to have a beautiful wedding in South Africa, but I'm not there to plan it. So
Mm.
who can I start coming together with? Who can I build community with so that this day is beautiful? But all these people that were a part of the planning, it wasn't just me. It was people that I observed, or my husband would tell me, oh, this person is really good at flowers. This person's an amazing videographer. This person. So it was now me calling these individuals, letting them know my bigger picture. But how can we work together for the bigger picture? So, this idea of cultural capital is this recognition that people can bring skill sets, they are valuable, and there's some things that will help us get to the bigger picture that may not be me having to do it, but it's because I've recognized there's a resource or a group of people that can work together so that we can arrive at the bigger picture. So I think there are two challenges. One, we may not have the same vision. Hence, we're not going to see you're valuable because we're not even really trying to get to the same place. Or secondly, we are not taking enough time to observe what people are good at
Right.
and being open to putting them in positions in which they're good.
Mm. And that, I mean, that takes you right back to that idea of sponsorship, right? Having a sponsor
Yes.
who can recognize not only all of the individual skills, the projects you've done, the work that you've done, but also your cultural capital as part of your value in the broader organizational structure. Rochelle, you've written not one, but three books. So I just want to ask you, why do you write?
Mm, I love this question. I remember seeing a quote by Toni Morrison, and she says, if there's a book you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, you write it.
Hmm.
And for me, particularly all of the books, but the most recent one, From D's to a Master's Degree, I was a Black student that was academically struggling. I was being overlooked. I didn't have the support or even mentorship in order to move from academic struggle to academic success. I
Mm.
think to myself, if I just saw someone who looked like me that was willing and able to tell me how they did it, I would have loved that. That would have made a difference. So I really wanted to be a mentor or a guide to as many Black students as I can to say, hey, if you're academically struggling right now, this isn't the end of your story. You too can go from D's to potentially a master's degree. So it's this idea that I actually didn't have a book that I really, really needed at the time that I needed that.
Mm.
Similar to Black Faces and White Spaces, Nine Secrets for Black Women to Thrive in the Workplace. Once again, I've seen the Black American lens sometimes, and maybe Black American writers as well, and career women. I've noticed that maybe there's a lot more champions around better experiences for Black women in the workplace. I haven't seen a Black Canadian writer who wrote a book to say, this is what's happening, and this is how you can still thrive. And I do talk. The reality is, you know how I said how you do one thing is how you do everything? There's a chapter in it that I talk about unhealthy relationships. So I give an example of domestic violence. And the nature of that relationship, there's no one that would look at a domestic violent relationship and say, this is amazing. That person is definitely going to thrive. No one would say something like that. But the reality is, we are in environments where we see Black women are overlooked, they're demeaned, they're disrespected, all
Mm.
of these things that we'd see in a domestic violence relationship outside of hitting.
Hmm.
We see all of these emotional things take place to this woman, and yet no one says anything often. We see it, we're silent, and she continues to have to stay in it. So, honestly, one of the chapters I talk about is an exit plan. Maybe you
Mm.
actually can't thrive there, but
Right.
what would an effective strategy look like? Because you still have bills to pay. But it's just this reminder, even for a woman who's experiencing domestic violence, there can be better relationships. You just think it's just this, and this
Yeah.
is all I can have. No, no,
Yeah.
no. There can be better work environments. There can be better bosses that you work for. There can be better all of these things, but you have to be willing to exit.
Yeah. Um, I love it when people write books for their past selves. Um,
Yes.
the books that you know that you wished that you'd had to
Yes.
guide your story. I think it's a really powerful way to frame a book
Yes.
and to speak to people who are unfortunately still repeating those same experiences.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I appreciate that you've shared your wisdom in the form of these books. And
Mm-hmm.
I want to ask you where people can find your books and
Mm-hmm.
just tell us a little bit more about who's published them and where we can get our hands on them.
Perfect. So for me, I write and I speak. To make things easier, I direct everyone to my website, which is www.rochellespeaks.info. There, you'll be able to purchase the book, or there you'll also be able to find out how you can get me to speak at your organization. I am a part of a speakers bureau, FKB Media. All that information is on my website, but that's the one-stop shop. But other than that, you just go to Amazon, put my name in, Rochelle, Ramathe, and all those books will come up.
Beautiful. My very last question is there someone else whose work you'd like to amplify?
Absolutely. So I want to amplify my colleague's work. Her name is Lavinia Latham. She's a Black Canadian human rights lawyer, and I want to elevate her work for two reasons. One, she was one of the Black women in my experience that she was a mentor, but not only that, there was a time that she saw how I was being disrespected in a meeting. And what she did, so she was at the highest level of the organization. What she was willing to do was to name what was transpiring at that moment. And she was able to advocate for me or speak up for me when I couldn't speak for myself.
Hmm.
But I found out that was because of what she studied. She's a human rights lawyer who does workplace investigations. So she's very clear about when microaggressions are taking place, when legally human rights violations are taking place. So for me, I think I really want to advocate for her work, not only because she's a lawyer and she understands what's happening, not only because she understands the Canadian aspect of things, but also because she's someone that was willing to put her skin in the game. She was
Hmm.
courageous enough to be outspoken about what transpired, and things were able to change in that organization just because of her courage.
Amazing. Oh, that's a happy story. And thank you for amplifying that. And it's a lovely way to close out the podcast as well, because it's just, evidence and a reminder that we can make a difference and that, being present, being a mentor, being a sponsor, and speaking out in rooms where other people may not be is part of that journey. So thank you so much for your wisdom. Thank you for the depth of this conversation. I really appreciate it. It means a lot to me that you're willing to take the time to do that and to educate me and also our listeners. I'm very grateful to you for all of that.
And I'm grateful to you. I think what you're doing is amazing, not only because of your identity, which I think is huge. A white woman doing this podcast, I think it is powerful, and I think the fact that you know that this is important, I think it speaks volumes. So thank you for you and the difference that you're making for workplaces just because you were willing to be courageous enough to have these conversations.
I really appreciate that. Thank you. Um,
You're welcome.
Dear listeners, if you want to stay connected with Rochelle Ramathe and follow her work and writing, the links to her website and also to her socials are in the show notes. And as always, I welcome any of our listeners to reach out to me if you'd like to be a featured guest on this podcast or if you'd like to nominate someone. My email address is in the show notes as well. If you like what you're hearing, please leave us a rating and a review or share this episode to your own socials. It truly does help get the podcast into more ears. I am Dominique Atrell. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time on Just One Q.